Hello, everyone. So, to talk about the course of World War II through this US history lens, I want to also look at it through a multicultural lens. So, just know here is the operating section, but this is not an exhaustive lecture. I'm going to cover these key terms below, and as always, I'll leave a note in the cards to the corresponding reading. And I'm going to ask a really broad guiding question as well. So, we're going to examine how different issues, both at home and abroad, are addressing sexism and racism. And again, this is through a US history perspective. So, let's get started by looking at African Americans in World War II. And let's start before the US even enters the war. So, as wartime production began before the US enters the war, so between 1939 and 1941, the United States continued its discriminatory and exclusionary hiring practices, and it relegated most jobs to whites only. And jobs that were available to African Americans before the war were almost always unskilled and the lowest paying. So things like janitorial work, and black workers were relegated to this type of job regardless of skill or level of education. Many labor unions excluded black workers, and some unions even entered into agreements with employers that prevented hiring any black workers at all. As far as the military is concerned, the U.S. military said it would accept black applicants in proportion to the percent of the population, which was about 11% at the time. But in reality, they never reached anything more than 9%, and this quota came from pressure from the NAACP directly to President Roosevelt. Black men were typically only accepted in certain military branches, such as the Army and the Navy. They were still excluded from the Marines and the Air Force primarily, although we'll touch upon the significance of the Tuskegee Airmen. And in the branches where they did serve, many initially worked as mess hall attendants, truck drivers, grave diggers, or cooks. And despite continued discriminatory practices, the Double V campaign saw a marked increase of African Americans serving in the military. And what the Double V campaign was this double strategy for victory, hence the name Double V. The idea was to achieve victory against the Nazis and to achieve victory against racism at home. In 1941, fewer than 4,000 African Americans were serving in the U.S. military, and in 1945, more than 1.2 million African Americans were serving in uniform, either on the home front, in Europe, and in the Pacific. And this also includes thousands of African American women who were serving in Women's Auxiliary Corps. Troop losses by 1945 led the military to place more black soldiers in positions like infantrymen, pilots, tankers, medics, and officers. And African Americans also pointed out that the discriminatory practices in the Third Reich against Jews were eerily similar to the Jim Crow South. So again, think about that goal of the Double V campaign. Again, I mentioned the Tuskegee Airmen previously. This is a really important and noteworthy advance in the integration of the U.S. military, specifically into the Air Force. The Tuskegee Airmen, named after the famous historical black college, Tuskegee Institute, they flew more than 15,000 escort missions between 1943 and 1945. And on top of that achievement, black women served in many military careers and held every position available, ranging from nursing to spies to postal clerks, phone operators, etc. And I suppose we should just ask, how successful was this Double V campaign? We will, of course, continue discussing this when we talk about the 1950s, but in the immediate sense, in 1948, President Truman issued an executive order to desegregate the military. So what that meant was the subsequent Korean War was the first racially integrated American war. Most post-war economic initiatives like the GI Bill, I'll talk about that more later, applied exclusively to white veterans. And the Federal Housing Administration routinely denied homeowner loans to non-white applicants as well. And it was largely the frustration felt in the years following World War II that led to the much larger campaign against racism at home, which will evolve into the more modern civil rights movement of the 1950s and 1960s. Again, more on that later. Let's move into the experiences of Japanese Americans during World War II, and we'll focus on internment and military service. So, because of Pearl Harbor, there were anti-Japanese sentiments, and these were fueled both by the media and by the government itself. And in 1942, FDR signed an executive order. It was number 9066, and this resulted in over 120,000 Japanese and Japanese Americans being removed from their homes in the West and placed in relocation centers, essentially like concentration camps. They were completely separated from their homes, cut off from communication, and these were almost exclusively in very desolate areas of the United States. Over half of those interned were Nisei, that's second generation Japanese Americans, so they were US citizens. They were forced to quickly sell possessions before they were ordered to relocate. And again, I said these were in desolate locations. That also means that they were enduring harsh living conditions, remote parts of the country, extreme climates. They lived in very cramped living quarters with little to no privacy. The children received inferior education. There was no plumbing in many of these facilities, etc. The Supreme Court ultimately upheld the internment policy in a case called Korematsu versus the United States. And still to this day, this specific ruling with regard to internment has not been overturned. So, of course, the Supreme Court has expanded protections for civil rights through the 14th Amendment, but this very, very specific and nuanced issue remains to be addressed again by the court. And the U.S. Congress issued a formal apology and also paid reparations to the victims of internment in 1988. As far as military service is concerned, because Japanese Americans were facing unjust discrimination, they often rushed to enlist in the armed services to prove their loyalty to the United States. Approximately 33,000 Japanese Americans served in all branches of the U.S. military during the Second World War. The most famous of those regiments was the 442nd Infantry, and that was composed almost entirely of Nisei from Hawaii. And Japanese American veterans served with distinction. By the end of the war, members of the 447 Infantry alone received some 4,000 Purple Hearts, 8 Presidential Unit Citations, 559 Silver Stars, and 52 Distinguished Service Crosses, among many other decorations. After the war, through the GI Bill, many Japanese Americans became the first in their families to attend college, and many attended medical and law schools. And the Japanese American Civil Rights Citizens League actively lobbied for civil rights legislation after the Second World War to push to amend laws overturning bans on interracial marriage, segregation, and race-based restrictions on immigration and naturalization. So again, you see that this is paving the path for more civil rights policies in the 1950s and 1960s. Approximately 500,000 Latinx Americans served in World War II. Women broke through important gender and cultural barriers during the war, and oftentimes bilingualism, a very highly sought after skill in the war, allowed women to find jobs in cryptology, communications, and interpretation. And on top of that, opportunities as nurses, Red Cross aides, to serve in the Women's Army Corps, the Naval Reserve, and the Marine Corps Reserve. So virtually any military career that was available to a woman at that point was available to Latina women. On the home front, Latinx Americans continued to face discrimination, but this again planted the seeds for more active engagement in the civil rights movement moving forward. So the Bracero program, even though it was introduced during the Great Depression, was still around. And the United States government thought it was crucial to the wartime economy, but it was very exploitative. It was a temporary program. There was no path to citizenship. And many Latinx Americans were deported in the 1950s in a militaristic deportation initiative. And this program, I'm not going to say the name of it. I can leave resources in the cards. And that's because the official program used a racial slur against Mexicans in its title. Another important example of discrimination during World War II, the Zoot Suit riots. And this occurred primarily in Southern California. And the subculture of Mexican American youth who call themselves Pachucos, often in an effort to rebel against Anglo culture, would dress in what were called zoot suits, a style featuring a long dress coat and baggy pants. And in LA in 1943, a group of white U.S. Navy sailors claimed they were attacked by a group of Pachucos, and then they invaded the Latino community in East LA, targeting youth wearing zoot suits that they came across and breaking out into fights. And in some instances, the local police actually accompanied the sailors and drove them around the city in order to seek violence against Pachuco youth. And they often then would give them a ride home afterwards. The cops, that is, would give these sailors rides home rather. Again, this is going to lead, though, to some tremendous civil rights efforts moving forward. Some of the future leaders of the Chicano movement began or continued their efforts after serving in uniform. And one of the most famous worth mentioning right now to come out of this era was Dr. Hector Garcia, who founded the American GI Forum, a civil rights group that is still active today, fighting for Latino rights in healthcare, education, labor agreements, and the court systems. And this is all, again, a response to the exclusion of Latino Americans from GI Bill benefits. So, Indigenous Americans, approximately 44,000 strong in the U.S. military during the Second World War, and again served with distinction. 3 soldiers of Indigenous descent received Congressional Medals of Honor, and that's the highest military award. The majority of Indigenous Americans who served in the military did so voluntarily rather than be drafted. Approximately 800 Indigenous American women also served in military positions available to them at the time. The language barrier between Indigenous Americans and the Axis powers was invaluable toward the Allied war effort. And so this brought about code talkers who created a code from Indigenous languages that the Axis powers were never able to break. So it facilitated crucial communication towards the Allies during the war. And historians often argue that code talkers helped accelerate the Allied victory. And on the home front, jobs available in the defense industry led over 40,000 Indigenous Americans to leave reservations for the first time in search of new jobs. Indigenous American women also took advantage of these jobs and worked for the Red Cross, the Civil Defense, and the Women's Volunteer Service during the war. And gains made during World War II continued, again, this push for civil rights. We see a theme here. Indigenous Americans formed solidarity movements with other civil rights activists to fight for federal recognition. Titles 2 through 7 of the Civil Rights Act of 1968, aka the Indian Civil Rights Act, signed by Lyndon Johnson, directly expanded civil rights and civil liberties of Indigenous Americans. So that's just one example there. Lots of things to talk about when we get to the civil rights movement soon. So again, here is the guiding question. I hope that this sheds some light on some key themes in terms of gender and race in World War II. Again, I apologize, this is not exhaustive, but due to the length of this video already, I'm going to leave it at that. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you soon.